Rapture becomes her. Chapter 7. Emily hoped she and Anne could arrive home without having to face Geoffrey or Mr. Answorth, but fate failed her. The jostling coach hardly pulled to a stop in front of the gracious old manor house before Geoffrey, braving the rain, appeared at the side of the coach and swung open the door with a flourish. Smiling, he glanced inside. His smile vanished when he realized that the coach held only two occupants, Emily and Anne. Peevishly he asked, "Lord Jocelyn did not accompany you home?" "No," replied Emily, stepping from the coach, followed by Anne, with Geoffrey trailing behind them. The two women hurried to the house. Inside, Walker, the Townsend family butler, met the two ladies and efficiently whipped away their outer clothing and directed them to the small blue sitting room, where, he said, a fire and a nice pot of tea awaited them. His blue eyes amused, he murmured to Emily's ear, "Your great aunt is most desirous of hearing every moment of your time with Lord Jocelyn," he coughed delicately. "You know how fond she is of the family." Emily choked back a laugh. "Yes, I seem to recall something to that effect." Cornelia wasn't the only person waiting for them in the blue sitting room. Posed negligently against the cream marble fireplace stood Mr. Answorth. There was nothing particularly notable about Mr. Answorth. He was neither short nor tall, neither lean nor fat, and if not precisely handsome, not unattractive. His eyes were a clear gray, his hair a soft brown, and his build neither muscular nor flabby, but somewhere in between. He was in Emily's opinion eminently forgettable, and she longed for the day he was, but in memory, one that never crossed her mind. Neatly garbed in a dark blue jacket, dove gray pantaloons, and black kid pumps, he lifted his quilting glass and all the ladies as they walked into the room. When his gaze fell upon her, Emily felt as if her gown's modest neckline fell to somewhere down around her waist and left her breast naked. From the pink in Anne's cheeks as her stepmother greeted Cornelia and drifted toward the tea tray in the middle of the room. She knew her stepmother had the same reaction. When he first arrived at the Bridges, Emily and the other ladies had started out being polite to Mr. Answorth. He was, after all, a guest, but they soon had his measure, as did everyone else in the household. The majority of the inhabitants at the Bridges heartily despised Mr. Answorth, only marginally less than they did Geoffrey. Once they realized they had an out-and-out rake on their hands, Emily and Cornelia saw no reason to endure Mr. Answorth's offensive glares and ribald comments and wasted no time in treating him to the sharp side of their tongues. Anne, being of a more retiring nature, avoided him when she could and suffered in silence when forced into his company, which was seldom, thanks to Emily and Cornelia's watchful eye. In no mood to put up with his lecherous appraisal, Emily asked with interest, "Are you aware, Mr. Answorth, how hideous that quizzing glass makes your eye look?" She shuddered. The sight of that huge orb bearing down on one is enough to cause those of a delicate nature nightmares. Smiling like a shark, she added, "Unfortunately, I am not one of them. But you would be wise upon whom you bend your glass." Mr. Answorth dropped the quizzing glass as if it scalded him and glared at her. "Emily!" Geoffrey thundered, entering the room behind her. "Will you mind your manners? Mr. Answorth is a guest." "Not mine," Emily said, startled boss, walking over to sit beside Cornelia, who was taken in the scene with a smile, patting Emily's hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. Cornelia murmured, "That's my girl. Don't hold your fire." Geoffrey's face darkened, and he took a threatening step forward, only to be brought up short when Anne thrust a cup and saucer at him. "See?" she asked brightly. Geoffrey fought to recover his equanimity. Except to Answorth, he never mentioned his unfortunate meeting with Lord Jocelyn that night at the Crown and hoping to redeem himself. He'd been elated when he heard that Lord Jocelyn had rescued Emily and Anne. He'd been certain that the Viscount would accompany the ladies home, and he looked forward to the opportunity to show himself in a more flattering disguise, and the privilege of being the first in the neighborhood to entertain his lordship. That his lordship had not escorted the ladies home had been a blow, and now his accused cousin was behaving to his guest with her usual disregard for anything remotely resembling civility. By God, if he didn't break her neck one of these days, it would be a miracle. Breathing heavily through his nose, he brushed aside the cup and saucer and muttered, "No, thank you. I am in no mood for tea." Anne held a smile and turned away, sitting near the other two women. Looking at Cornelia, she asked, "May I get you something, some tea, or would you like a few of those lovely lemon biscuits Mrs. Spaulding baked for us?" Cornelia waved away the offer of refreshments, and glancing expectantly from Anne to Emily, demanded, "Well, now that you have had an opportunity to spend some time in his company, what did you think of the newest Lord Jocelyn?" She shook her finger at them. "And don't be coy." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Geoffrey burst out as he poured himself some port from the same tray that held the tea things. "I'm sick of all the way all the ladies in the neighborhood are in the title of a Lord Jocelyn," he sniffed. "Believe me, he's merely a man like any other. To listen to you tabbies, I think the fellow walked on water." "I seem to recall that you strutted around here, all cock a whoop over the notion that he would escort Emily and Anne home tonight," Cornelia observed. "One might have been mistaken in believing that you were the most anxious to meet him yourself." Geoffrey ignored her jab and took a swallow of his port, imagining the expression on the old Haradine's face when he made his announcement. Looking superior, he declared, "I have met him." Since the three ladies had been privy to a blow-by-blow description of that meeting from Flora some time ago, they were to be congratulated on their expressions of surprise. For a moment's pause, while Geoffrey congratulated himself on the effort of his announcement, Cornelia demanded with just the correct amount of amazement in her voice, "If you never said anything before now?" "Oh my," said Anne. Her eyes were very big and innocent. "How very exciting. When did you meet him?" "Yes," murmured Emily, her skepticism striking the right note. "Tell us when you met him." She took a sip of her tea. Looking over the rim of her cup, she asked, "Was it recent? Why have you not told anyone?" Answorth cleared his throat and murmured, "He mentioned it to me a few weeks ago." Cornelia favored him with a glance that made him step back before returning her attention to Geoffrey. "Please do tell us about your meeting with him," urged Cornelia. She fluttered her lashes and came as close to simmering as she dared. "You know how much we will appreciate hearing a gentleman's impression of him." Geoffrey shot her a suspicious look, but Cornelia kept her face properly composed. Airily, Geoffrey said, "I met him a fortnight or so ago while he was staying at the Crown." Emily frowned. "But wasn't he ill when he was staying there? Surely I remember Mrs. Gilbert saying something about the poor man being so sick he never left his room." Apparent as if something had occurred to her, she looked at him askance. "Oh, Geoffrey, do not tell me," she protested, "that you were so determined to be the first to meet him that you forced upon yourself while he was ill." "I didn't force myself upon him," he replied through gritted teeth. Resentment scorched his breast. This was all her fault. If she'd been in her bedroom where she was supposed to have been when he checked that night, he wouldn't have had a damn uncomfortable ride through the storm to the Crown in search of her and burst into Lord Jocelyn's private room. "Wish you never brought up the subject," Geoffrey complained. "The fellow didn't impress me much, and I do not understand why everyone is so eager to make his acquaintance." "Then you're a bigger fool than you look," Cornelia said tartly. Good gad, man, use your head. Taking the points off on her bony fingers, she said, he's not married. He has an old and notable title. He's wealthy. He owns one of the largest, grandest estates in the area. No wonder every marriageable woman or those with unmarriageable daughters are dying to meet him. She smiled at Emily and Anne. And just think, our darlings have beaten them all to the match. Emily and Anne looked at each other and then at Cornelia. You're not suggesting that one of us would, Emily began uneasily, would make him a suitable bride? Asked Cornelia. Liking the trend of the conversation, Geoffrey perked up. If he could marry Anne off to Answorth and Emily to Lord Jocelyn, he almost cried aloud in delight. The britches would be his without the pesky presence of these wretched females. Even Cornelia would be gone. She would go live with either Emily or Anne, or he thought viciously, she suffer a fatal fall down the main staircase if he had to push her himself. Excellent idea, Geoffrey said, smiling benignly at Emily. He said, you make an outstanding Viscountess, my dear, and just think how proud such an honor would have made your father. Emily glowered at him. She knew precisely what he was thinking. Force Anna to marriage with Answorth, and then somehow engineer her own marriage to Lord Jocelyn. Remembering her reaction to Lord Jocelyn when he had entered the morning room and Windmere, an odd sensation rippled through her at the idea of being married to him. It wasn't an unpleasant sensation, but neither was it pleasant. Mostly she decided it was unsettling, and perhaps just a trifle excited. Ignoring the flutter in her stomach, Emily said, what other nonsense. I wish Lord Jocelyn well in the marriage stakes, but I am not in the running. Standing up, she shook her gown and remarked, and no, if no one minds, I am for bed. It has been a long and tiring day. Indeed it has, agreed Anne, rising gratefully to her feet, following Emily's lead. She smiled at the gentlemen. The hour is late, and I'm sure you gentlemen understand. Cornelia gave a cackle of laughter. Don't matter if they do. Townsend women always do as they please. She rose from her chair, and her cane thumped on the floor as she limped to the door. Before Geoffrey or Answorth could protest, the three women were out of the room and gone. Left alone, Answorth stared hard at Geoffrey. I would remind you, Answorth said in a cold tone. That time is running out. If I do not have a bride in less than 2 months, I shall lose a large fortune in your vows that I hold will come due, and you will lose a tidy sum I have promised you. His expression ugly, he said. My time here so far has been wasted. I could have looked elsewhere, and I could have made arrangements with someone else, but you swore I had my bride. It ain't my fault you haven't settled things with the little widow, Geoffrey argued. You're a man of the world. You can't expect me to do your courting for you. But I can hardly court the charming Mrs. Townsend if she's never around, and was snapped. I have done my damnedest, but that long-necked cousin of yours, that old witch is always hovering around her. Accusingly, he said, you've been telling me for weeks that you would arrange everything, but so far I have been no progress. I can hardly seduce her for you. I can do my own seducing, Answorth drawled. But you need to create the opportunity when I can seduce her. He glanced around the room and sniffed, with servants always popping in and out. Your female relatives nearly inseparable. It is hardly likely to happen anywhere in this house. I need time alone with the lady to accomplish my seduction. Geoffrey would not meet his gaze, knowing full well that they were not talking about seduction, but rape. He hadn't wanted it to come to that, but Anne's persistent repulsion of Answorth's advances made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with him, and had left him with no other choice. Thank God, Geoffrey thought, that Answorth's choice had fallen upon his uncle's widow, and not the Tangerman. Emily. It boggled the mind imagining Emily's reaction to a forced seduction. She not submit tamely, and Geoffrey wasn't positive that even facing room that she wanted spun Answorth's offer of marriage. He shuddered. Emily was far more likely to go after Answorth for the night. But Anne was a sweet thing. Once Answorth had compromised her, there was no question in Geoffrey's mind that she meekly married her seducer, guessing correctly that Emily would not be in Answorth's life. Despite having offered his friend his choice of the two women, from the beginning he assumed that Anne would suit Answorth's purpose beautifully. Really, it was a pity he decided, that Answorth had not caught Anne's fancy. It would have made things so much simpler for him. He sighed, resigned to it, but not happy about his part in arranging for Answorth thoroughly compromised his uncle's widow. But needs must when the devil drives, he reminded himself self-righteously. He desperately needed Answorth to return those numerous vows he so foolishly offered after a night of drunken gambling. As a vital as if he was to bring himself out and get out of his done territory, he must have the other money his friend had promised him. Staring down his glass of port, Geoffrey said, "It can't be at the house." "I know that, you fool," Answorth fist banged the mantel. "I am not familiar with the area you are. Surely you know of some place I can meet privately with her long enough." He smiled, his gray eyes cold and calculating. "Long enough to accomplish my task. I know of a place," Geoffrey admitted. He cleared his throat. "I've used it upon occasion myself. There's a deliciously willing little widow in the village who visits me there from time to time." At Answorth's look of interest, Geoffrey said, "It's a small, comfortable farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. Kelsey's woman Rosie, from the Ram's Head, keeps it clean and stocked for me, and she's discreet." Answorth frowned. "How near the village? It must be private." An emphatic smile crossed his lips. "I'm sure the lady will protest, perhaps loudly, and I do not want any interruptions." "You have nothing to worry about," Geoffrey assured him. "The house is a mile or so from the edge of the village and sits a good half-mile back from the road. In fact, if you didn't know the house was there, you ride right past it. The driveway leading to it is partially overgrown, and hedges and trees surround the house itself. There's even a stable at the rear where you can hide your horse and vehicle." "Uncomfortable?" Geoffrey muttered. "You don't have to worry that you'll be disturbed." "Excellent," said Answorth, rubbing his hands together. "How soon can you make arrangements?" Within a few minutes a plan was arranged. "It's a shame that you let Kelsey go," said Answorth, as the two men prepared to leave the room, and adjourned to the gaming room at the rear of the house. "He might have been of help to us. Certainly we cannot rely on any of the other servants, not even our valets." "I didn't have any choice," Geoffrey growled, resentment again staring in his breast. "Cornelia forced my hand." Bitterly he added, "But it is Kelsey's own fault. I warned him not to overstep his bounds with Anne, but he ignored me." "She is a tempting armful, isn't she?" Answorth said, as they strode down the hall, passing Walker as they did so. Blind to the butler, as he was to servants in general, Answorth murmured, "I quite look forward to furthering my acquaintance with your uncle's widow," he laughed low, "especially without interruption. I'm relying on you to arrange it, my dear friend." His voice hardened. "I'm not wasting any more time, willing or not. I will be married to her within a fortnight, or it will go ill for you." Walker didn't hear Geoffrey's reply, but his expression was alarmed as he entered the blue room and gathered up the tea tray and the various glasses and cups and saucers scattered about, returning to the kitchen, where Mrs. Spaulding was busy putting some dough near the small fire to rise in time to bake fresh bread in the morning. He sat down the tray and said, "I fear that Master Geoffrey and Mr. Answorth are up to no good." The other few servants still employed at the Pritchards had gone to bed, and it was only the two of them in the pleasant kitchen. While not related, the butler and the cook had been in service with the Townsend family since they were children, both of them stepping into positions once held by their parents. They were easy in each other's company and spoke freely to one another. Wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron, Mrs. Spaulding snorted. "If you ask me, those two are always up to no good. A more disreputable pair I've never met. The old squire would roll over his grave if he knew the sort of riffraff Master Geoffrey invites here these days." She shook her head. "We known Master Geoffrey since a boy. And I don't know about you, but he's never been a favorite of mine nor the old squire's, I might add. That boy was always into trouble and then whining and blaming everyone else when caught doing something he shouldn't. Her face softened. Now his brother, young Master Hugh, as different as cheese is to chalk, she sighed. It's a shame that Master Hugh didn't inherit how different things would be. Walker nodded unhappily. I agreed. If Master Hugh was here, even the master wouldn't dare allow Answorth to act so outrageously around the ladies. That's not likely to happen. Master Geoffrey doesn't want him around, and unfortunately, the britches is his, and he can say who comes and who goes. When Walker continued to look weary, Mrs. Spaulding cocked a brow and asked, "Is there something specific that has you concerned?" Walker related the bit of conversation he overheard as he had passed the two men in the hall. Her lips pursed. Mrs. Spaulding admitted, "I don't like the sound of that at all." Moving efficiently about her kitchen as she put away a few items, she said, "You talk to Miss Emily or Miss Cornelia in the morning. They'll warn the mistress to be careful, and they'll be on the lookout for any tricks." Walker nodded, relieved that Mrs. Spaulding agreed with him. Waited impatiently the next morning for the ladies to descend from the upper reaches of the house, knowing the gentlemen had imbibed heavily the night before was as their wont, and that they had not gone to bed until the hour had struck 4. He felt confident that Mrs. Townsend was safe for the moment. Still, he breathed a sigh of relief when the three ladies came down the stairs and into the slightly shabby but daily familiar breakfast room. He allowed the ladies to save themselves from the old oak sideboard and settle around the table before he spoke. He gave her a polite cough, and then the three women looked at him. He murmured, "You know it is not my habit to gossip or spy, but I overheard a bit of conversation between the two gentlemen last night that I feel you must know." "Spill it," barked Cornelia, setting down her cup of coffee and staring hard at the butler. She knew Walker all his life and his father before him, and knew that something important must have occurred for him to break protocol. "What is it, Walker?" Emily asked softly. Anxiety seizing her. "Is it something to do with our business arrangement? Has Geoffrey discovered what we are about?" Walker was one of the investors in their smuggling operations, and he knew precisely what she meant by business arrangement. Walker smiled fondly at her, but his smile faded almost as quickly as it had appeared. His face sober, he said, "No, miss. It has nothing to do with our business." He glanced at Anne, who was watching him as closely as the other women. Apologetically, he said, "I fear that Master Geoffrey and Mr. Answorth has some evil plan for Mrs. Townsend." Succinctly, he told them what he had heard as he had passed the two men in the hallway. None of the women needed to explain to them when Geoffrey and Answorth planned if they meant to force Anne into marriage with Answorth. "Those devils!" Emily exclaimed, her eyes nearly silver with fury. Anne's face was white with fear, and her fingers shook as she set down her cup of coffee. "You think they mean to kidnap me, Anne?" Her throat closed up. She could not say the ugly words aloud. "Mean to compromise you one way or another," said Cornelia, looking older and wearier than Emily or Anne had ever seen her. Walker nodded unhappily. "Yes, this is what I fear." He tried to smile reassuringly at Anne as he said, "We shall keep you safe. Mrs. Spaulding, Jane, Sally, and the other servants we can trust will see to it that you are never alone." It was some comfort, but they all knew that keeping Anne continually under surveillance was going to be nearly impossible. Despite their loyalty to Emily, Anne and Cornelia, Geoffrey had to be obeyed unless they wished to lose their positions, and there were dozens of ways he could arrange for many of the servants that remained at the breeches to be away from the house. There were always errands to be run, trips to the village for supplies and the like, even with the servants on her side. Anne's best hope lay with Cornelia's eagle eye and Emily's fierce presence. Emily touched Anne's hand. "We will protect you." Emily took a deep breath. "I know you will," she smiled warmly at Walker. "And I know that you and the others will do your best." Her shoulders straightened, and she said, "We will all be on our guard and pray that we can outwit these scoundrels." After Walker bowed and walked from the room, it was a very quiet trio of ladies who sat around the breakfast table. Not had No one had any appetite, and after nibbling at a piece of toast, Emily pushed it away. Her expression was dangerous, she swore. By God, this is intolerable, and is being driven to slaughter like any lamb, and we are near helpless to prevent it. Emily had never resented her sex more than she did at this moment, and tears of frustration and fury filled her eyes. Oh, if only I had been born a man, my dreadful cousin would never have inherited, and we'd not be on the brink of ruin. No one is dependent on what cannot be, said Cornelia. Her gaze soft as it rested on Emily's tight features. Don't fret, my pet. We will plan our defenses, and we will come about, even if I have to stab Answorth with a carving knife, where, where it will do the most good. Both Anne and Emily chuckled weakly. And if you don't, Emily said, then I shall, her eyes darkened, and Geoffrey, while I am at it. Since no one had any appetite, the three ladies left the breakfast room a few minutes later. Anne and Emily retired to the small room off the kitchen that Emily had taken over as her office to go over the depressing account books. Unusually, Cornelia returned upstairs to her room to write or answer some letters from her network of off-flung friends. This morning, however, upon reaching her room, she rang for Walker. He arrived a few minutes later and found Cornelia settled behind her cherrywood desk, ink nearby, a sheet of paper before her and quill in hand. How soon? She asked bluntly. As soon as the butler shut the door behind him. Do you think we had before they strike? Walker shrugged helpless. Answorth mentioned marriage within a fortnight. Or it will go ill for Geoffrey, Cornelia muttered. I wonder what that Letcher has on that twig. Geoffrey is a weak fool, but I've never known him to be vicious, she blurted over Geoffrey's defiance. A moment before unknowingly repeated Mrs. Spaulding's words of the previous evenings. If only Hugh had inherited, now there's a fine young man. Walter didn't disagree, but there was nothing to be gained from speculation about how different everything would be if Hugh had been the elder brother instead of the younger. Dismissing the butler, Cornelia said, I will not normally ask you or any of our servants to spy, but in this case I would urge you to keep your eyes and ears open. Mrs. Townsend's safety will depend upon it. Walker nodded grimly and left. Alone in her room once again, Cornelia stared out the window for a long time. The day was gray and gloomy and fit her mood perfectly, she thought sourly. She did like growing old, she admitted, but she had never chafed against it, nor felt as weak and helpless as she did now. She was an old woman, old and useless, pushing aside her dissent and stupidity. She considered how best to save the two people that meant the most to her in the world. No matter the cost, it didn't matter what happened to her. Her time had come and gone. Cornelia grinned, and by gad, she lived, but Emily and Anne. Her smile faded, and she scowled. If that damn nephew of hers had been a better father and a better husband, Emily would be happily married now, and Anne would have had a child or two if Squire stayed home from the hunt long enough, and one of them might have been a boy in hair. Vigilant with a square, she sighed. The previous squire hadn't been a bad father or a terrible husband, she considered, just an indifferent one. With her brother, he seen that Emily was launched into society, and he rented a fine town house, spent lavishly on Emily's wardrobe for not one but 2 seasons in London. Emily had been just 17 that first season, but even then, her great niece had decided notions about the character of any man who might wish to marry her. None of her suitors, and there had been more than one young man and an old rug or two who had been enchanted by their fair hair, great eyes, slender beauty. That first year or the second had aroused anything but amusement or contempt in her breast. Always spirited and strong-willed, Cornelia admitted, guilty that she was so much to blame for her as her father's indulgence. When they come home from London after that second season, Emily had announced that she would not endure being paraded through London like a prize filly again. There would be no third season for her. Cornelia had been appalled, but nothing she could say swayed Emily. Her heart heavy, she resigned herself to the knowledge her lovely girl would die a spinster, knowing that if several eligible London bachelors found no favor with Emily, it was unlikely that she found a match better in the country. Shortly afterward, the squire had gone looking for his own bride. Cornelia's wrinkled face softened. Dear sweet little Anne, she forgiven her nephew long ago for springing an unknown bride on them, and she could not love Anne any more than she did Emily or a daughter of her own. They are my daughters, she thought fiercely, and I will move heaven and earth to save them. If only that drabbed Geoffrey wasn't such a buffalo-headed coxcomb, or more like his younger brother Hugh. If he knew what his brother was up to, welcome or not, he'd be on the steps of the bitches before the cat could lick her ear. Hugh would send that obnoxious Answorth packing, and most likely give Geoffrey a sound thrashing. An arrested expression on her face. She stared down at the paper before her. Hugh, a gleeful smile on her lips. She began to write. Finally,